Rama, Rama, Hari, Hari, Rama, 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 Hari, Rama, 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 Hari, Rama, Hari. Oh, Rasa Priya, Hari Bol. Hari Bol. E Krishna Priya Toja. Hari Bol. Spasiba. Hari Bol. No, сейчас через минутку japa закончится. И лекция будет. Таковы жизни. Ram, Ram, Hari, 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 Krishna, Hari, Krishna, Krishna, Hari, Hari, Hari. Ram, Ram, Hari, 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 Krishna, Krishna, Hari, Hari. Hari, Ram, Hari, Ram. Ram, Ram, Hari, 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 Krishna, Krishna, Hari, Hari, Hari. Ram, Ram, Hari, Hari, Hari. Ram, Ram, Hari, Hari, Hari. Krishna, Krishna, Hari, Hari, Hari. Ram, Ram, Hari, Hari, Hari. Jai Shakapriya. Ram, Ram, Hari, Hari, Hari. Krishna, Hari, Krishna, Krishna, Hari, Hari, Hari. Ram, Hari, Ram. Ram, Ram, Hari, Hari, Hari. Krishna, Hari, Krishna, Krishna, Hari, Hari, Hari. Ram, Hari, Ram. Ram, Ram, Hari, Hari, Hari. Krishna, Hari, Hari, Ram, Hari, Ram. Ram, Ram, Hari, Hari, Hari. Krishna, Hari, Krishna, Krishna, Hari, Hari, Hari. Ram, Hari, Ram. Ram, Ram, 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 Hari, Hari, Hari. Ram. Ram, Ram, Hari, Hari, Hari. Ram, Hari, Ram. Ram, Ram, Hari, Hari, Hari. Krishna, Hari. Krishna, Krishna, Hari, Hari, Hari. Okay. Hari Bol. Pridnia. See you later. Uvinam Sapoja. Bad Malenge. Okay, devotees. So, yes, oops. We are going to continue. We're starting tonight, chapter 19 of Prabhupada-lilamrita, Planting the Seed. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Presta Bhutale Shrimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharne Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pastya Chadesh Tarne Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Shri Advaita Gadadha Shivasadi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Vanchakapatarubhyascha kripa sindhu bhyevacha Patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. So, chapter 19, planting the seed. From a conversation between Srila Prabhupada and Hayagriva. Does what you told us this morning, Howard asked, mean we're supposed to accept the spiritual master to be God? That means he's due the same respect as God, being God's representative, Prabhupada replied calmly. Then he's not God. No, Prabhupada said, God is God. The spiritual master is his representative. Therefore, he's as good as God because he can deliver God to the sincere disciple. Is that clear? August 1966. It was makeshift, a storefront turned temple, and a 2-room apartment transformed into the Guru's residence and study. But it was complete nonetheless. It was a complete monastery amid the city slums. The temple, the storefront, was quickly becoming known among the hip underground of the Lower East Side. The courtyard was a strangely peaceful place for aspiring monks, with its little garden, bird sanctuary, and trees, squeezed in between the front and rear buildings. The Swami's back room was the inner sanctum of the monastery. Each room had a flavor all its own, or rather, it took on its particular character from the Swami's activities there. The temple room was his kirtan and lecture hall. The lecture was always serious and formal, even from the beginning when there was no dais and he had to sit on a straw mat facing a few guests. It was clear he was here to instruct, not to invite casual give and take dialogue. Questions had to wait until he finished speaking. The audience would sit on the floor and listen for 45 minutes as he delivered the Vedic knowledge intact, always speaking on the basis of Vedic authority, quoting Sanskrit, quoting the previous spiritual masters, delivering perfect knowledge supported with reason and argument. While contending with noises of the street, he lectured with exacting scholarship and deeply committed devotion. It appeared that he had long ago mastered all the references and conclusions of his predecessors, and had even come to anticipate all intellectual challenges. He also held kirtans in the storefront. Like the lectures, the kirtans were serious, but they were not so formal. Prabhupada was lenient during kirtan. Visitors would bring harmoniums, wooden flutes, guitars, and they would follow the melody or create their own improvisations. Someone brought an old string bass and bow. Shoo! That's a big, really big instrument. And an inspired guest could always pick up the bow and play along. Some of the boys had found the innards of an upright piano waiting on the curb with someone's garbage, and they had brought it to the temple and placed it near the entrance. During a kirtan, freewheeling guests would run their hands over the wires, creating strange vibrations. Robert Nelson, several weeks back, had brought a large symbol that now hung from the ceiling, dangling close by the Swami's dais. But there was a limit to the extravagance. Sometimes when a newcomer picked up the cartels and played them in a beat other than the standard 1, 2, 3, Swamiji would ask one of the boys to correct him, even at the risk of offending the guest. Prabhupada led the chanting and drummed with one hand on a small bongo. Even on this little bongo drum, he played Bengali mridanga rhythms, so interesting that a local conga drummer used to come to hear. He said, "The Swami gets in some good licks." The Swami's kirtans were a new high, and the boys would glance at each other with widening eyes and shaking heads as they responded to his chanting, comparing it to their previous drug experiences and signaling each other favorably. "This is great. It's better than LSD. Hey man, I'm really getting high on this." And Prabhupada encouraged their newfound intoxication. As maestro of these kirtans, he was also acting expertly as guru. Lord Chaitanya had said, "There are no hard and fast rules for chanting the holy name." And Prabhupada brought the chanting to the Lower East Side just that way. A kindergarten of spiritual life, he once called the temple. Here he taught the ABCs of Krishna consciousness, lecturing from Bhagavad Gita and leading the group chanting of Hare Krishna. Sometimes after the final kirtan, he would invite those who were interested to join him for further talks in his apartment. In the back room of his apartment, Prabhupada was usually alone, especially in the early morning hours, 2, 3, and 4 a.m., when almost no one else was awake. In these early hours, his room was silent, and he worked alone in the intimacy of his relationship with Krishna. He would sit on the floor behind his suitcase desk, worshipping Krishna by typing the translations and purports of his Srimad Bhagavatam. But the same back room was also used for meetings, and anyone who brought himself to knock on the Swami's door could enter and speak with him at any time, face to face. Prabhupada would sit back from his typewriter and give his time to talking, listening, answering questions, sometimes arguing or joking. A visitor might sit alone with him for half an hour before someone else would knock, and Swamiji would invite the newcomer to join them. New guests would come and others would go, but Swamiji stayed and sat and talked. Generally, visits were formal. His guests would ask philosophical questions, and he would answer, much the same as after a lecture in the storefront. But occasionally, some of the boys who were becoming serious followers would monopolize his time, especially on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and Sunday nights, when there was no evening lecture in the temple. Often they would ask him personal questions. What was it like when he first came to New York? What about India? Did he have followers there? Were his family members devotees of Krishna? What was his spiritual master like? And then Prabhupada would talk in a different way, quieter, more intimate and humorous. He told how one morning in New York, he had first seen snow and thought someone had whitewashed the buildings. He told how he had spoken at several churches in Butler, and when the boys asked what kind of churches they were, he smiled and replied, "I don't know," and they laughed with him. He would reminisce freely about the British control of India and about Indian politics. He told them it was not so much Gandhi as Subhas Chandra Bose who had liberated India. Subhas Chandra Bose had gone outside of India and started the Indian National Army. He entered into an agreement with Hitler that Indian soldiers fighting for British India who surrendered to the Germans could be returned to the Indian National Army to fight against the British. And it was this show of force by Bose, more than Gandhi's non-violence, which led to India's independence. He talked of his childhood at the turn of the century, when streetlights were gaslit and carriages and horse-drawn trams were the only vehicles on Calcutta's dusty streets. These talks charmed the boys even more than the transcendental philosophy of Bhagavad Gita and drew them affectionately to him. He told about his father, Gormohan Dey, a pure Vaishnav. His father had been a cloth merchant, and his family had been intimately related with the aristocratic Maliks of Calcutta. The Maliks had a deity of Krishna, and Prabhupada's father had given him a deity to worship as a child. He used to imitate the worship of the Govinda deity in the Maliks temple. As a boy, he had held his own Rath Yatra festivals each year, imitating in miniature the gigantic festival at Jagannath Puri. And his father's friends used to joke, "Oh, the Rath Yatra ceremony is going on at your home, and you did not invite us. What is this?" His father would reply, "This is a child's play, that's all." But the neighbors said, "Oh, child's play? You're avoiding us by saying it's for children." Prabhupada fondly remembered his father, who had never wanted him to be a worldly man, who had given him lessons in mridanga, and who had prayed to visiting sadhus that one day the boy would grow up to be a devotee of Radharani. One night, he told how he had met his spiritual master. He told how he had begun his own chemical business, but had left home and in 1959 had taken sannyas. The boys were interested, but so ignorant of the things Prabhupada was talking about, that at the mention of a word like mridanga or sannyas, they would have to ask what it meant. And he would go on conversational tangents, describing Indian spices, Indian drums, even Indian women. And whatever he spoke about, he would eventually shine upon it the light of the Shastra. He did not ration out such talk, but gave it out abundantly by the hour, day after day, as long as there was a real live inquirer. At home, the front room became a dining hall, and in the evenings a place of intimate worship. Prabhupada had kept the room, with its 12-foot square, hardwood parquet floor, clean and bare. The solitary coffee table against the wall between the two courtyard windows was the only furniture. Daily at noon, 12 men were now taking lunch here with him. The meal was cooked by Keith, Kirtanananda, who spent the whole morning in the kitchen. At first, Keith had cooked only for the Swami. He had mastered the art of cooking dal, rice, and sabji in the Swami's 3-tiered boiler, and usually there'd been enough for 1 or 2 guests as well. But soon more guests had begun to gather, and Prabhupada told Keith to increase the quantity, abandoning the small 3-tiered cooker, until he was cooking for 12 hungry men. The boarders, Raphael and Don, though not so interested in the Swami's talk, would arrive punctually each day for prasadam, usually with a friend or two who had wandered into the storefront. Steve would drop by from his job at the welfare office. The Mott Street group would come, and there were others. The kitchen was stocked with standard Indian spices, fresh chilies, fresh ginger root, whole cumin seeds, turmeric, and asafoetida. Keith mastered the basic cooking techniques and passed them on to Chuck, who became his assistant. Some of the other boys would stand at the doorway of the narrow kitchenette to watch Keith as one thick, pancake-like chapati after another blew up like an inflated football over the open flame and then took its place in the steaming stack. While the fine basmati rice boiled to a moist, fluffy white finish and the sabji simmered, the noon cooking would climax with the chaunts. Keith prepared the chaunts exactly as Swamiji had shown him. Over the flame, he set a small metal cup, half filled with clarified butter, and then put in cumin seeds. When the seeds turned almost black, he added chilies, and as the chilies blackened, a choking smoke began to pour from the cup. Now the chaunts was ready. With his cook's tongs, Keith lifted the cup, its boiling, crackling mixture, fuming like a sorcerer's kettle, and brought it to the edge of the pot of boiling dal. He opened the tight cover slightly, dumped the boiling chaunts into the dal with a flick of his wrist, and immediately replaced the lid. Pow! The meeting of the chaunts and dal created an explosion, which was then greeted by cheers from the doorway, signifying that the cooking was now complete. This final operation was so volatile that it once blew the top of the pot to the ceiling with a loud smash, causing minor burns to Keith's hand. Some of the neighbors complained of acrid, penetrating fumes, but the devotees loved it. When lunch was ready, Swamiji would wash his hands and mouth in the bathroom and come out into the front room. His soft, pink-bottomed feet always bare, his saffron dhoti reaching down to his ankles. He would stand by the coffee table, which held the picture of Lord Chaitanya and his associates, while his own associates stood around him against the walls. Keith would bring in a big tray of chapatis stacked by the dozens and place it on the floor before the altar table, along with pots of rice, dal, and sabji. Swamiji would then recite the Bengali prayer for offering food to the Lord, and all present would follow him by bowing down, knees and head to the ground, and approximating the Bengali prayer one word at a time. While the steam and mixed aromas drifted up like an offering of incense before the picture of Lord Chaitanya, the Swami's followers bowed their heads to the wooden floor and mumbled the prayer. Prabhupada then sat with his friends, eating the same prasadam as they, with the addition of a banana and a metal bowl full of hot milk. He would slice the banana by pushing it downward against the edge of the bowl, letting the slices fall into the hot milk. Prabhupada's open decree that everyone should eat as much prasadam as possible created a humorous mood and a family feeling. No one was allowed simply to sit picking at his food, nibbling politely. They ate with a gusto Swamiji almost insisted upon. If he saw someone not eating heartily, he would call the person's name and smilingly protest, "Why are you not eating? Take prasadam." And he would laugh. When I was coming to your country on the boat, he said, I thought, how will the Americans ever eat this food? And as the boys pushed their plates forward for more, Keith would serve seconds, more rice, dal, chapatis, and sabji. After all, it was spiritual. You were supposed to eat a lot. It would purify you. It would free you from Maya. Besides, it was good, delicious, spicy. This was better than American food. It was like chanting. It was far out. You got high from eating this food. They ate with the right hand Indian style. Keith and Howard had already learned this and had even tasted similar dishes. But as they told the Swami in a room full of believers, the food in India had never been this good. One boy, Stanley, was quite young, and Prabhupada, almost like a doting father, watched over him as he ate. Stanley's mother had personally met Prabhupada and said that only if he took personal care of her son would she allow him to live in the monastery. Prabhupada complied. He diligently encouraged the boy until Stanley gradually took on a voracious appetite and began consuming 10 chapatis at a sitting. Oh, Krishna, I can hardly manage one. And would have taken more had Swamiji not told him to stop. But aside from Swamiji's limiting Stanley to 10 chapatis, the word was always, more, take more. When Prabhupada was finished, he would rise and leave the room. Keith would catch a couple of volunteers to help him clean, and the others would leave. Occasionally, on a Sunday, Prabhupada himself would cook a feast with special Indian dishes. Steve. Swamiji personally cooked the prasadam and then served it to us upstairs in his front room. We all sat in rows, and I remember him walking up and down in between the rows of boys, passing before us with his bare feet, and serving us with a spoon from different pots. He would ask, what did we want? Did we want more of this? And he would serve us with pleasure. These dishes were not ordinary, but sweets and savories, like sweet rice and kachoris, with special tastes. even after we had all taken a full plate, he would come back and ask us to take more. Once he came up to me and asked what I would like more of. Would I like some more sweet rice? In my early conception of spiritual life, I thought I should deny myself what I liked best, Haribol. So I asked for some more plain rice. But even that plain rice was fancy yellow rice with fried cheese balls. Cheese balls. That's good. On off nights, his apartment was quiet. He might remain alone for the whole evening, typing and translating Srimad Bhagavatam, or talking in a relaxed atmosphere to just one or two guests until 10. But on meeting nights, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, there was activity in every room of his apartment. He wasn't alone anymore. His new followers were helping him, and they shared in his spirit of trying to get people to chant Hare Krishna and hear of Krishna consciousness. In the back room, he worked on his translation of the Bhagavatam or spoke with guests up until 6 when he would go to take his bath. Sometimes he would have to wait until the bathroom was free. He had introduced his young followers to the practice of taking 2 baths a day, and now he was sometimes inconvenienced by having to share his bathroom. After his bath, he would come into the front room, where his assembled followers would sit around him. He would sit on a mat facing his picture of the Panchatattva, and after putting a few drops of water in his left palm from a small metal spoon and bowl, he would rub a lump of Vrindavan clay in the water, making a wet paste. He would then apply the clay markings of Vaishnav tilak, dipping into the yellowish paste in his left hand with the ring finger of his right. He would scrape wet clay from his palm, and while looking into a small mirror, which he held deftly between the thumb and pinky of his left hand, he would mark a vertical clay strip up his forehead, and then trim the clay into 2 parallel lines by placing the little finger of his right hand between his eyebrows and running it upward past the hairline, clearing a path in the still moist clay. Then he marked 11 other places on his body while the boys sat observing, sometimes asking questions or sometimes speaking their own understandings of Krishna consciousness. Prabhupada. Prabhupada, my Guru Maharaj used to put on tilak without a mirror. Devotee, did it come out neat? Prabhupada, neat or not neat, that does not matter. Yes, it was also neat. And, I can just mention, when we were on Padayatra in Europe for 3 months, something like 3 months, just walking, sleeping in tents and all that. We had no mirrors. And we had to put on tilak with no mirror. And it usually worked out. Okay. Prabhupada would then silently recite the Gayatri Mantra, holding his Brahman's sacred thread and looping it around his right thumb. He would sit erect, silently moving his lips. His bare shoulders and arms were quite thin, as was his chest, but he had a round, slightly protruding belly. His complexion was as satiny smooth as a young boy's, except for his face, which bore signs of age. The movements of his hands were methodical, aristocratic, yet delicate. He picked up 2 brass bells in his left hand and began ringing them. Then, lighting 2 sticks of incense from the candle near the candle near the picture of Lord Chaitanya, while still ringing the bells, he looked deeply at the picture and continued cutting spirals of fragrant smoke, all the while ringing the bells. None of the boys knew what he was doing, although he did it every evening. But it was a ceremony. It meant something. The boys began to call the ceremony bells. After bells, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, it would usually be time for the evening kirtan. Some of the devotees would already be downstairs greeting guests and explaining about the Swami and the chanting. But without the Swami, nothing could begin. No one knew how to sing or drum, and no one dared think of leading the mantra, chanting without him. Only when he entered at 7 o'clock could they begin. Freshly showered, and dressed in his clean Indian hand-woven cloth, his arms and body decorated with the arrow-like Vaishnav markings, Prabhupada would leave his apartment and go downstairs to face another ecstatic opportunity to glorify Krishna. The tiny temple would be crowded with wild, unbrahminical, candid young Americans. Candid, okay. That's a good way of putting it. They say what they like. Dawn was a test of Swamiji's tolerance. He'd lived in the storefront for months, working little and not trying to change his habits. He had a remarkable speech, affectation. Instead of talking, he enunciated his words as if he were reciting them from a book. And he never used contractions. It wasn't that he was intellectual, just that somehow he developed a plan to abolish his natural dialect. Don's speech struck people as bizarre, like it might be the result of too many drugs. It gave him the air of being not an ordinary being. And he continuously took marijuana, even after Swamiji had asked those who lived with him not to. Sometimes during the day, his girlfriend would join him in the storefront, and they would sit together talking intimately and sometimes kissing. But he liked the Swami. He even gave some money once. He liked living in the storefront, and Swamiji didn't complain. But others did. One day, an interested newcomer dropped by the storefront and found Don alone, surrounded by the sharp aroma of marijuana. "You been smoking pot? But the Swami doesn't want anyone smoking here." Don denied it. "I have not been smoking. You are not speaking the truth." The boy then reached in Don's shirt pocket and pulled out a joint, and Don hit him in the face. Several of the boys found out. They weren't sure what was right. What would the Swami do? What do you do if someone smokes pot? Even though a devotee was not supposed to, could it be allowed sometimes? They put the matter before Swamiji. Prabhupada took it very seriously, and he was upset, especially about the violence. "He hit you?" he asked the boy. "I'll go down myself and kick him in the head." But then Prabhupada thought about it and said that Don should be asked to leave. But Don had already left. The next morning, during Swamiji's class, Don appeared at the front door. From his dais, Swamiji looked out at Don with great concern. But his first concern was for ISKCON. "Ask him," Prabhupada requested Roy, who sat nearby, "if he has marijuana. Then he can't come in. Our society." Prabhupada was like an anxious father, afraid for the life of his infant ISKCON. Roy went to the door and told Don he would have to give up his drugs if he entered, and Don walked away. Raphael was not interested in spiritual discipline. He was a tall young man with long, straight brown hair who, like Don, tried to stay aloof and casual towards Swamiji. When Prabhupada introduced japa and encouraged the boys to chant during the day, Raphael didn't go for it. He said he liked a good kirtan, but he wouldn't chant on beads. One time, Swamiji was locked out of his apartment, and the boys had to break the lock. Swamiji asked Raphael to replace it. Days went by. Raphael could sit in the storefront reading Rimbaud. He could wander around town, but he couldn't find time to fix the lock. One evening he dropped by the Swami's apartment, opened the lockless door, and made his way to the back room where some boys were sitting, listening to Swamiji speak informally about Krishna consciousness. Suddenly Raphael spoke up, expressing his doubts and revealing his distracted mind. "As for me," he said, "I don't know what's happening. I don't know whether a brass band is playing or what the heck is going on." Some of the devotees tensed. He had interrupted their devotional mood. "Raphael is very candid," Swamiji replied, smiling, as if to explain his son's behavior to the others. Raphael finally fixed the lock, but one day after a lecture he approached the Swami, stood beside the dais, and spoke up, exasperated, impatient. "I'm not meant to sit in a temple and chant on beads. My father was a boxer. I'm meant to run on the beach and breathe in big breaths of air." Raphael went on, gesticulating and voicing his familiar complaints, things he would rather do than take up Krishna consciousness. Suddenly Prabhupada interrupted him in a loud voice. "Then do it! Do it!" Raphael shrank away, but he stayed. Sure. Bill Epstein took pride in his relationship with the Swami. It was honest. Although he helped the Swami by telling people about him and sending them up to see him in his apartment, he felt the Swami knew he'd never become a serious follower. Nor did Bill ever mislead himself into thinking he would ever be serious. But Prabhupada wasn't content with Bill's take-it-or-leave-it attitude. When Bill would finally show up at the storefront again after spending some days at a friend's place, only to fall asleep with a blanket wrapped over his head during the lecture, Prabhupada would just start shouting so loud that Bill couldn't sleep. Sometimes Bill would ask a challenging question, and Prabhupada would answer and then say, "Are you satisfied?" And Bill would look up dreamily and answer, "No." Then Prabhupada would answer it again more fully and say louder, "Are you satisfied?" And again Bill would say no. This would go on until Bill would have to give in. "Yes, yes, I'm satisfied." But Bill was the first person to get up and dance during a kirtan in the storefront. Some of the other boys thought he looked like he was dancing in an egotistical, narcissistic way, even though his arms were outstretched in a facsimile of the pictures of Lord Chaitanya. But when Swamiji saw Bill dancing like that, he looked at Bill with wide open eyes and feelingly expressed appreciation. Bill is dancing just like Lord Chaitanya. Bill sometimes returned from his wanderings with money, and although it was not very much, he would give it to Swamiji. He liked to sleep at the storefront and spend the day on the street, returning for lunch or kirtans or a place to sleep. He used to leave in the morning and go looking for cigarettes on the ground. To Bill, the Swami was part of the hip movement and had thus earned a place of respect in his eyes as a genuine person. Bill objected when the boys introduced signs of reverential worship toward the Swami, starting with their giving him an elevated seat in the temple. And as the boys who lived with the Swami gradually began to show enthusiasm, competition, and even rivalry among themselves, Bill turned from it in disgust. He allowed... Oh, wait a minute, where am I? Sorry. He allowed that he would go on just helping the Swami in his own way. And he knew that the Swami appreciated whatever he did. So he wanted to leave it at that. Carl Jurgens had helped Prabhupada in times of need. He had helped with the legal work of incorporating ISKCON, signed the ISKCON charter as a trustee, and even opened his home to Swamiji when David had driven him from the Bowery loft. But those days when he and Eva had shared their apartment with him had created a tension that had never left. He liked the Swami. He respected him as a genuine sannyasi from India, but he didn't accept the conclusions of the philosophy. The talk about Krishna and the soul was fine, but the idea of giving up drugs and sex was carrying it a little too far. Now Prabhupada was settled in his new place, and Carl decided that he has done his part to help and was no longer needed. Although he had helped Prabhupada incorporate his International Society for Krishna Consciousness, he didn't want to join it. Carl found the Second Avenue kirtans too public, not like the more intimate atmosphere he had enjoyed with the Swami on the Bowery. Now the audiences were larger, and there was an element of wild letting loose that they'd never had on the Bowery. Like some of the other old associates, Carl felt sheepish and reluctant to join in. In comparison to the Second Avenue street scene, the old meetings in the fourth floor Bowery loft had seemed more mystical, like secluded meditations. Carl Becker also preferred a more sedate kirtan. She thought people were trying to take out their personal frustrations by the wild singing and dancing. The few times she did attend evening kirtans on 2nd Avenue were tense moments. One time a group of teenagers had come into the storefront mocking and shouting, "Hey, what the hell is this?" She kept thinking that at any moment a rock was going to come crashing through the big window. And anyway, her boyfriend wasn't interested. James Green felt embarrassed. He saw that most of the new men were making a serious commitment to the Swami, whereas he could not. He had no bad feeling toward the Swami and his new movement, but he preferred to live alone. Robert Nelson, Prabhupada's old uptown friend, never deviated in his good feelings for Prabhupada, but he always went along in his own natural way and never adopted any serious disciplines. Actually, he became initiated in the 90s, Robert Nelson. I met him in, I think, 92, 93, something like that, maybe 94. Somehow, almost all of those who had helped Prabhupada uptown and on the Bowery did not want to go further once he began a spiritual organization, which happened almost immediately after he moved into 26 2nd Avenue. New people were coming forward to assist him, and Carl, James, Carol, and others like them felt that they were being replaced and that their obligation toward the Swami was ending. It was a kind of changing of the guard. Although the members of the old guard were still his well-wishers, they began to drift away. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Good God.